All right, so buckle up because today's deep dive is going to take us on quite a ride.
It's one of those conversations that just spiraled out of control in the best way possible.
Yeah, we're talking about everything from a flat Earth experiment in Antarctica to some seriously mind-bending possibilities about the pyramids at Giza.
And then we'll touch on social media, healthcare, weight loss trends, personal growth, you name it.
Basically, we're taking this one massive, sprawling conversation and distilling it down to the absolute most fascinating and thought-provoking bits.
Think of it as your cheat sheet to a rabbit hole you might not have time to go down yourself.
Okay, so let's start with something that's guaranteed to raise a few eyebrows. Flat Earth theory.
Specifically, this final experiment, as they called it, organized by a guy named Will Duffy.
Apparently, he managed to convince a group of both flat earthers and the globies, as they call them.
To fork over 35 grand each for a trip to Antarctica.
The goal, to observe the sun's behavior over a full 24 hours, something that the flat Earth model, really struggles to explain.
They had drones, 360 cameras, even live streams, the whole 9 yards.
And get this, 3 of the 4 flat earthers on that trip reportedly changed their minds after seeing how the sun actually moves.
Now that right there is fascinating, right? You've got people with deeply ingrained beliefs confronted with direct observational evidence that challenges those beliefs.
It makes you think about the power of empirical data, even when we're talking about really, really strong convictions.
Of course, this being the internet, the story didn't end with everyone suddenly embracing a spherical Earth.
Oh no, the conspiracy theories started swirling almost immediately.
Some folks claiming that the entire experiment was faked, maybe even filmed in the Sphere in Las Vegas.
Which I gotta say is a pretty wild theory in itself.
And speaking of Antarctica, the conversation also went into these so-called Antarctic pyramids that people have spotted on Google Maps.
Yeah, those things look pretty convincing in the pictures.
But chances are they're not actually ancient man-made structures.
What, so no lost civilization hiding under the ice?
Probably not. Most likely these pyramids are just submerged mountain peaks poking up through the ice.
Makes sense. Still, it's a cool example of how our brains are wired to find patterns in familiar shapes, even when they might not actually be there.
Right. It's like seeing faces in clouds or, pyramids in mountain ranges.
Speaking of pyramids, let's shift gears from the frozen south to the scorching deserts of Egypt.
There's been some buzz lately about new discoveries at the Great Pyramid of Giza.
Yeah, this just came out on March 16th. Some findings using some really advanced radar technology.
It's called non-invasive synthetic aperture radar Doppler tomography.
Okay, that's a mouthful.
Basically, it's like using sound waves to see what's beneath the surface, but instead of sound, they use electromagnetic waves.
So like an X-ray for the ground.
Exactly. And what they've reportedly found is pretty mind-blowing.
Lay it on me.
They claim to have identified massive structures extending over 600 meters deep from the base of the Great Pyramid right into the bedrock.
That's like almost 2,000 feet.
And it gets even crazier. These structures might be connected to even larger formations that stretch as far as 2 kilometers below the surface.
2 kilometers. Now that's just hard to even wrap your head around.
Unsurprisingly, not everyone is buying into these findings.
Yeah, I bet Zahi Hawass is having none of this.
You got it. He already dismissed the whole thing as complete nonsense.
Well, it wouldn't be a major archaeological discovery without some controversy.
It's always interesting how new evidence is received, especially when it challenges established ideas.
Right, like people are pretty set in their ways, especially in a field like Egyptology.
It's worth mentioning that Graham Hancock, who hasn't always seen eye to eye with Zahi Hawass, is now apparently on good terms with him.
Really? That's interesting. What does Hancock think about these new radar findings?
Well, the conversation didn't get into that specifically, but it does highlight the complex dynamics within the field of Egyptology.
Yeah, interpretations can shift over time, especially as new evidence emerges.
Exactly. And then there's Christopher Dunn, who's got this pretty wild theory about the Great Pyramid.
What was he saying?
He believes it wasn't actually a tomb, but some kind of ancient power plant.
Okay, now that's an interesting one.
It ties into a bigger theme that came up a lot in this conversation. The tendency to dismiss certain theories, not based on their actual merits, but because of who else believes them.
You mean like guilt by association?
Exactly. Like if someone you don't agree with believes something, then anything even remotely similar must also be automatically wrong.
We see this a lot with the Atlantis theory, right? It gets linked to white supremacist ideologies just because some historical figures who were racist also happen to believe in Atlantis.
Yeah, it's kind of lazy thinking, like, oh, I don't like this person, so everything they believe must be bad.
Right, and that kind of thinking can really stifle genuine intellectual curiosity and exploration.
Okay, let's take a sharp turn now and dive into the world of social media and some of the broader societal trends that came up in this conversation.
Sounds good.
So, one point that really stood out was how using really complex language can sometimes create a false sense of expertise. Oh, yeah, someone throws around a bunch of fancy words and intricate sentences, they can sound really authoritative, even if they're not actually saying anything of substance.
It's like they're trying to dazzle you with their vocabulary instead of actually making a solid point.
Exactly. It's a tactic that can be used intentionally or unintentionally to make people think you know more than you actually do.
And going back to the flat Earth thing for a second, it seems like that final experiment in Antarctica really caused a stir within the flat Earth community.
It definitely ruffled some feathers. Some people doubled down on their beliefs, while others, like those who went to Antarctica, started to have serious doubts.
It shows you how powerful those core beliefs can be and how challenging them can lead to some pretty unpredictable reactions.
Absolutely. And then there's the interesting relationship between mainstream media and independent media.
Yeah, it seems like the old guard is often referencing independent creators as a way to boost their own traffic.
It's like they're trying to tap into the audience that independent voices have built up, often by covering topics that mainstream media has ignored.
Right. It's almost like they're acknowledging that independent media is setting the agenda in a lot of ways.
Exactly. And then there's this whole perception that anything considered masculine is now automatically labeled as right-wing.
Oh, yeah, that one's definitely a hot topic.
Things like being interested in fitness, having a certain kind of humor, enjoying traditionally male hobbies, they're all getting viewed through this political lens.
Which can be incredibly divisive, right? Like, it's reducing people down to these simplistic labels.
And speaking of labels, that Media Matters study that labeled a bunch of independent media figures as right-wing came up.
Even some who openly identify as left-leaning.
Right. Chris Williamson, who was actually part of this original conversation, was apparently at the top of that list.
Which, I mean, says a lot about how those labels are being assigned, right?
Yeah, the criteria can be pretty broad. Simply expressing support for a certain political figure or questioning certain narratives can be enough to get you labeled as right-wing.
It's almost like they're trying to shut down any dissenting voices.
And that leads us to John Cleese's analysis of extremism, which he actually wrote 30 years ago but feels super relevant today.
What's his take?
Well, he pointed out that one of the most appealing things about extremism is that it gives you a clear enemy.
Right, like us versus them.
Exactly, and that allows people to project all the bad stuff in the world onto that outgroup, making themselves feel righteous and morally superior.
Oh, I can definitely see how that'd be appealing.
It's seductive. You get to feel good about yourself by vilifying someone else.
Cleese even had these lists of authorized enemies for both the hard left and the hard right.
Things like police and corporations on one side, unions and weirdos on the other.
And the funny thing is, both sides agree that moderates are the enemy.
Right. It's like, if you're not with us 100%, you're against us.
And this whole dynamic, while it's probably always existed, seems to have gotten amplified by social media.
Definitely. It gives extremist viewpoints a much wider and more immediate reach.
It's easier than ever to find your tribe, so to speak, and then bond over your shared hatred of another tribe.
Exactly. And that brings us to the idea of performative empathy versus genuine good deeds.
Ah, yes, the age of virtue signaling.
It's the difference between making a big show of caring about something and actually putting in the work to make a difference.
Right, it's one thing to post about a cause, it's another thing to actually donate your time or money.
And social media makes it easy to do both, which can create this interesting dynamic where people are constantly trying to one-up each other with their displays of empathy.
It's like a competition to see who can be the most woke.
And then there's the observation that people who are constantly attacking others online are often dealing with their own deep-seated issues.
Yeah, the classic case of projection.
They're projecting their own insecurities and negativity onto others as a way of avoiding dealing with their own problems.
It's a lot easier to point fingers than it is to look in the mirror.
Absolutely. And then there's this concept of criticism capture, which is kind of like audience capture, but in reverse.
What does that mean?
Well, instead of creators trying to please their fans, they start shaping their content primarily in response to negative feedback.
So they're letting the haters dictate their work.
In a way, yes. They become so focused on avoiding criticism that they start self-censoring or becoming overly defensive.
That sounds like a recipe for creative burnout.
It definitely can be. It creates this fear of putting anything out there that might be perceived negatively.
Which ultimately leads to less interesting and less authentic work.
Exactly. And underlying a lot of this seems to be our basic human tribalism.
The whole us versus them mentality.
Right. We have this deep-seated need to belong to a group. And one way we do that is by defining ourselves in opposition to another group.
And social media makes it so easy to find those groups and reinforce those divisions.
Absolutely. And the conversation also touched on how quickly political positions can shift, using Tesla as a prime example.
Yeah, it's crazy how Tesla went from being a darling of the left to being a target of protests and vandalism.
It shows how fluid political allegiances can be, and how even seemingly apolitical choices, like the car you drive, can become politicized.
Right, like suddenly your choice of vehicle is a statement about your values and beliefs.
And then there's the issue of how protests are being funded, often by NGOs, potentially even with taxpayer money through U.S. aid.
Yeah, that raises some serious questions about transparency and accountability.
Right. Like, are our tax dollars being used to support political activism, even indirectly?
It's a slippery slope.
And then there was this observation that some on the left seem to be upset about the idea of ending the war in Ukraine and uncovering fraud.
Really? That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but it highlights the complex and sometimes contradictory nature of political viewpoints.
Right, like different values and priorities can lead to some unexpected alignments and disagreements.
And then there's the bizarre phenomenon of people on the left painting swastikas on cars as a way to associate their opponents with Nazism.
That's just messed up on so many levels.
It's a really extreme form of symbolic aggression, using incredibly loaded imagery to try to demonize the other side.
It's like they're trying to shut down any debate or discussion by resorting to these emotionally charged tactics.
And then there was this interesting comparison made between Elon Musk and Donald Trump's son at inauguration, focusing on their different styles of presentation.
I remember that. They were both in the same room, but they couldn't have been more different in their demeanor.
It was used to illustrate the diversity within any group of people, even those who might be on the autism spectrum.
Right. It's a reminder that we should avoid making broad generalizations based on limited observations.
And then there's the whole issue of political fatigue and how the media tends to focus on trivial and sensational events.
Yeah, it's like we're constantly bombarded with information,
Right.
but most of it is just noise.
It's hard to stay engaged when you're constantly being overwhelmed with minor controversies and distractions.
And it's ironic that the people who consume the most news are often the most educated and the wealthiest.
Right. You'd think they'd be too busy with their lives to keep up with every twist and turn of the news cycle.
But maybe it's because they have more at stake in terms of how things are run.
That could be a factor. And then to round out this section on social media and societal trends, the idea of downstream media came up again.
You mean how legacy media is essentially following the lead of independent media?
Exactly. It's like independent creators are setting the agenda and mainstream media is just playing catch up.
Okay, let's shift gears once again and talk about healthcare and weight loss.
Okay, ready.
So this conversation didn't pull any punches when it came to criticizing the U.S. healthcare system.
Yeah, they went so far as to call it barbaric compared to the UK's National Health Service.
That's a pretty strong statement.
They really drove that point home with a story about medical debt in New Orleans, illustrating how easily people in the U.S. can get financially ruined by healthcare costs.
It's a really sobering reminder of how broken our system is.
And then there's the whole revolving door between the FDA and pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah, that doesn't exactly inspire confidence.
It raises a lot of ethical questions about potential conflicts of interest.
Right, like are these regulatory decisions being made with the best interests of patients in mind, or are they being influenced by corporate profits?
And then there's the financial incentives for doctors to prescribe certain medications.
Yeah, getting bonuses for pushing certain drugs or facing penalties for not meeting quotas.
It's a system that can definitely create perverse incentives and lead to suboptimal care.
It makes you wonder whose interests are really being served.
And then there's the FDA ban on compounded Ozempic.
Which essentially limits competition in the market. Right?
Exactly. It protects the market share of the big pharmaceutical companies and potentially keeps prices higher.
It's like they're saying, hey, we know this drug is in high demand, but we're going to make it harder for people to get it.
And this led to a really interesting theory that the introduction of Ozempic has exposed the scam of the body positivity movement.
Whoa, okay, now that's a bold claim.
The argument is that the rapid embrace of Ozempic by people who previously championed body positivity might suggest that, for some, that stance was more about resignation than genuine self-acceptance.
Like, they were saying they were happy with their bodies, but they actually weren't.
That's the idea. And the fact that so many women in Hollywood have jumped on the Ozempic bandwagon, despite all their talk about embracing bigger sisters, seems to support that theory.
It's like they were saying one thing, but doing another.
Exactly. And the conversation also touched on how easy weight loss through drugs might be devaluing the signal of being in shape.
What do you mean?
Well, traditionally, being fit was seen as a sign of discipline, hard work, and commitment.
Right, it was something you earned through effort.
But now, with drugs like Ozempic, that signal gets muddled.
Like, it's hard to know if someone's physique is the result of their lifestyle choices or just a pill.
Exactly. It kind of takes away from the accomplishment of getting in shape the old-fashioned way.
And then there are the potential side effects of these GLP-1 drugs, like Ozempic.
Yeah, there's a risk of pancreatitis, loss of muscle mass, bone loss, things like that.
It's a reminder that these medications, while they might be effective, aren't without their risks.
Absolutely. And then there's Johan Hari's perspective on weight loss and BMI.
What's his take?
He basically says that if your BMI is under 30, you probably shouldn't be obsessing over weight loss.
Instead, you should focus on overall health and well-being.
Right, like eat a balanced diet, exercise regularly, and don't worry so much about the number on the scale.
And there was this idea that thin people might be more prejudiced against Ozempic users than people who have struggled with their weight.
It's like they feel like their hard-earned fitness is being devalued by this easy fix.
While people who have struggled with weight loss might see Ozempic as a welcome tool.
Exactly. And then they even applied Pascal's wager to weight loss.
Pascal's wager. That's the argument for believing in God.
Right. So the analogy is either you take Ozempic and risk being accused of cheating, or you lose weight naturally and still potentially face accusations or judgment.
It's like a no-win situation.
Kind of, yeah. And the conversation did emphasize the importance of combining Ozempic with exercise.
That makes sense. It's not just a magic pill. You still need to put in the work.
Right. And exercise can help counteract some of the potential side effects of the drug.
Okay, are you ready to go down a serious rabbit hole now?
I'm always up for a good rabbit hole. What do we got?
Let's talk about some of the mind-bending personal growth and existential thoughts that came up in this conversation.
Lay it on me.
We're starting with the Boltzmann brain theory.
Okay, this is one of those ideas that'll really make you question your reality.
It basically says that it's statistically more likely for a fully formed brain, complete with all your memories and consciousness, to spontaneously pop into existence for a brief moment.
Then for the entire ordered universe we observe to have arisen as it did.
So you're saying there's a chance that our entire existence is just a random blip in the cosmic void.
That's the gist of it, yeah.
It's a pretty unsettling thought, isn't it?
It definitely makes you question everything you thought you knew.
And then, just to blow our minds even further, we've got the concept of infinite universes with infinite variations of ourselves and our lives.
Ah, yes, the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics.
It's the idea that every time a quantum event with multiple possible outcomes happens, the universe splits.
And each new universe reflects one of those possible outcomes.
So you're saying there's a version of me out there who made every different choice I could have possibly made.
That's the idea, yeah. Infinite possibilities, infinite universes.
And if that wasn't enough, we also have the possibility of entire universes existing within black holes.
Some physicists believe that the singularity at the center of a black hole could be a gateway to another universe.
So like black holes are just cosmic wormholes leading to other realities.
That's one theory, yeah. And it's pretty mind-blowing.
It's like those Russian nesting dolls, but with universes.
And then there's Terence McKenna's view on the Big Bang, which he considered the one miracle that science requires.
You mean how the universe seemingly arose from nothing?
Right. He saw that as a pretty big leap of faith, not entirely dissimilar to faith in a religious context.
It's definitely something that science still struggles to fully explain.
And then we have supervoids, these enormous areas of space that are almost completely empty.
Yeah, it's like there are these giant cosmic deserts out there.
It makes you wonder how matter got distributed so unevenly throughout the universe.
And then, you take all of that together and it really puts things into perspective.
Yeah, you start to realize just how insignificant we are in the grand scheme of things.
It's humbling, but also kind of liberating in a way.
Right. It's like our problems might seem really big to us, but in the context of the vastness of the universe, They're pretty small potatoes.
Okay, let's come back down to earth for a bit and talk about some more practical stuff.
All right, let's do it.
The conversation emphasized the importance of taking long trips with a partner to really gauge relationship compatibility.
Oh, yeah, travel can definitely put a relationship to the test.
When you're navigating unfamiliar environments, dealing with logistics, spending extended periods of time together, it can really reveal your strengths and weaknesses as a couple.
It's like a pressure cooker for your relationship.
And then we veered into the somewhat unexpected territory of varicocele.
Those are pretty common, actually.
Yeah, it's basically enlargement of the veins in the scrotum,
And it can affect fertility and testosterone levels in some men.
which is something most guys probably don't want to hear.
Right. And then there's the interesting fact that while dick transplants are becoming a reality, ball transplants are still off the table.
Why is that?
It's because of the DNA implications. Sperm carries a person's genetic information.
So if you transplanted someone's testicles, they could potentially father children with the donor's DNA.
Exactly. It creates a whole mess of ethical and legal issues.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a problem.
And then there's the whole ethical debate surrounding surrogacy.
It's a really complex issue with a lot of different perspectives.
There are questions about the bond between the surrogate and the child, the potential for exploitation, the psychological impact on the child, and so on.
It's definitely not a simple black and white issue.
And then there's the alarming trend of plummeting sperm counts globally.
Yeah, that's pretty concerning.
It's potentially linked to environmental factors like microplastics, as highlighted by Shanna Swan's work.
It's like our own pollution is coming back to bite us in the,
Yeah, in the reproductive system.
And then there's the equally concerning trend of rising obesity rates.
It's a global epidemic at this point.
It's crazy to think that the average American pig now has a lower body fat percentage than the average American human.
That really puts things into perspective.
And then there's the observation that men are facing increasing challenges in education and early career earnings.
Yeah, more women are completing college degrees now, and there's a growing gap in early career earnings.
It's a complex issue with a lot of potential contributing factors.
Differences in learning styles, societal expectations, the influence of the educational environment, maybe even a lack of inspiring male role models in certain fields.
Some people even suggested that the left's puritanism might be making it harder for people, especially men, to shift their political views.
It's an interesting idea. Like, if you're afraid of being canceled or ostracized for expressing certain views, you're less likely to speak your mind.
And that can stifle intellectual growth and debate.
Absolutely. And then there's the idea that traditional corporate environments might not be a good fit for a lot of men.
The whole emphasis on collaboration, communication, and social skills.
Right. It's not exactly the most conducive environment for guys who prefer to work independently or have different communication styles.
And then there's the realization that material success doesn't automatically equate to happiness.
That's a lesson a lot of people learn the hard way.
You chase after money and status, and then you get there and you're like, wait, this isn't what I thought it would be.
It's because true happiness comes from within, not from external validation.
And then there's the specific challenges faced by type A personalities.
Those high achievers who are always striving for more.
Yeah, they often get less sympathy for their struggles because they seem to have it all together on the surface.
But they can be dealing with a lot of stress, anxiety, and burnout.
It's like they're successful, but they're not happy.
And then there's the lonely chapter of personal growth.
That period where you feel disconnected from your old friends, but you haven't found your new tribe yet.
It's a necessary part of the process, but it can be really tough.
It's like you're shedding your old skin and growing into a new one, but it takes time to find your people.
And the media doesn't really portray that part of personal growth very realistically.
Yeah, they always make it seem so linear and triumphant.
But in reality, it's messy, there are setbacks, and there's a lot of self-doubt along the way.
And there's often this unspoken value exchange involved in choosing personal growth over staying comfortable with your existing friends.
Like you're choosing to invest in yourself, even if it means leaving some people behind.
It's a tough decision, but sometimes it's necessary for growth.
And the U.S., for all its faults, is actually a pretty encouraging environment for risk-taking and personal growth.
Yeah, there's this cultural emphasis on individualism and the pursuit of your dreams.
And there's more tolerance for failure here than in a lot of other countries.
Like, it's okay to try something and fail as long as you learn from your mistakes and keep moving forward.
Exactly. And a lot of high performers start out needing external validation for their achievements.
Like needing awards and recognition to feel like they're on the right track.
It's a natural human tendency, especially early in your career.
But eventually you have to learn to find validation from within.
Right, you have to develop your own internal compass and stop relying on external approval.
And then there's this universal human tendency to ignore the advice of our elders and historical precedent.
Like, we always think we know better.
And then we end up making the same mistakes that people have been making for centuries.
It's like we have to learn everything the hard way.
And then we have those basic bitch insights that suddenly become profound when we experience them firsthand.
It's like those things your parents always told you, but you didn't really get it until you lived it yourself.
And then there's the weird phenomenon of people being hostile towards wealthy or famous people who express unhappiness.
It's like they think that having money and fame somehow exempts you from experiencing negative emotions.
It's a lack of empathy, really,
And then there's the difference between achieving your desires and being able to renounce them.
which Naval Ravikant talks about a lot.
He says that true freedom comes from being able to let go of your desires, not from acquiring more and more stuff.
It's like you can have all the money in the world, but if you're still constantly chasing after more, you'll never be truly content.
Exactly. And then there's the importance of valuing the process, not just the outcome.
Like enjoying the journey, not just the destination.
They use the analogy of playing Call of Duty versus being in actual warfare.
It's like the game is exciting and fun, but it's not real.
Real life is messy, and achieving anything worthwhile takes hard work, dedication, and resilience,
And then there's the reality of being a content creator in the digital age.
which can be incredibly demanding and stressful.
It's not just about making videos and posting them online. You have to constantly engage with your audience, deal with haters, and come up with fresh content all the time.
It's a constant hustle.
And it's important to find other people who are moving at a similar velocity of personal growth.
Right. You need people who understand what you're going through and can support you on your journey.
And you might have to outgrow certain friendship groups multiple times throughout your life.
It's natural for your social circle to evolve as you change and grow.
It can be painful to leave people behind, but sometimes it's necessary for your own well-being.
And everyone needs at least one highest agency person in their life.
Someone who's resourceful, decisive, and gets stuff done.
They're the people you call when you need help, and you know they'll always have your back.
And then there's the challenges and dangers faced by police officers.
It's a tough job, and they put their lives on the line every day.
And the defund the police movement has had some unintended consequences.
It's led to lower morale among officers and potentially increased crime in some areas.
It's a complex issue with no easy solutions.
And the media often portrays police in a negative light, focusing on the few bad apples.
Which creates a distorted perception of law enforcement as a whole.
Right, it's like they're only showing you the worst-case scenarios.
And it seems like some political figures are having a hard time controlling the narrative these days.
The media landscape is so fragmented now, it's hard for anyone to really dominate the conversation.
And then there's the New York Times finally admitting they were misled about the lab leak theory.
It's a reminder that even the most respected news organizations can get things wrong.
And once information is out there on the internet, it's hard to take it back.
The internet never forgets.
And there's a speculation about what might happen if Trump wins again.
It would definitely shake things up.
And then there's the ongoing protests and vandalism against Tesla.
It shows how polarizing certain brands and individuals can be.
And Elon Musk is trying to expose waste and fraud in government spending.
Which is always a controversial move.
And whistleblowers and investigative journalists are still incredibly vulnerable.
They risk a lot to bring important information to light.
It's important to pay attention to the things that the media isn't covering, but that future historians will be studying.
Like the impact of smartphones on our society.
And we spend way too much time on screens these days.
It's affecting our sleep, our attention spans, and our overall well-being.
And algorithms are shaping our online experiences in ways we might not even realize.
They're not just predicting our behavior, they're actually influencing it.
And ultimately, it's all about aligning our desires with our willingness to live the life necessary to achieve those desires.
It's not enough to just want something. You have to be willing to put in the work.
Well, that was quite a journey.
We covered a lot of ground.
It's amazing how all these seemingly disparate topics can actually connect together.
It gives you a more holistic view of the world.
So, after hearing all of that, what long-held belief might you be ready to re-examine?
And what warning from history are you maybe overlooking?
It's something to think about.
Definitely food for thought.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.
Take care.